Hello Horror Hounds, welcome to my horror house. It's time for another James Herbert book review, and we have reached his fourth book, Fluke, which by quite some margin is the absolute outlier of his very varied output. It tells the story of Fluke the dog. The story starts with Fluke's birth, and we follow the dog as he grows and learns and realizes that he is not like other dogs. He's very specifically not like other dogs in as much as he can remember having once been a man, and as more memories of his previous life bubble back to the surface, he realizes he still has a family, a wife and a daughter who are in danger from the man that killed him. So he makes it his mission to journey back to his family, protect them, and find out what has happened to him. First and foremost, it must be said that this is not a horror novel. It was published in 1977, and I can remember sort of paperback copies from around that time, back when the backs of paperbacks used to have what genre they were in, sticking it in horror simply because it was a James Herbert novel, and James Herbert writes horror novels, right? I think if this book was coming out now and he was operating now, I think people would quite easily just understand, oh, James Herbert's writing a YA novel now. But YA novels weren't even a thing back then. I have absolutely no idea how this was sort of received at the time. I don't know whether his diehard horror fans really didn't take to it just simply because it's not a horror story. I read it when I was very young, and I've got to admit, I absolutely fell in love with it. It was the second book I read cover to cover in one sitting, just because I simply couldn't put it down. I can still vividly remember staying up through the night to read it, and I just kept thinking to myself, oh, I'll just read one more chapter, then I really have to go to sleep because I've got school in the morning. And then the next chapter would end with a cliffhanger or a revelation. I think, oh, right, I'll just read one more chapter, just one more. And I just finished it, ultimately, eventually, couldn't put it down. And rereading it again as an adult, I can see why. I didn't scream through it like I did upon that first read, but what it strikes me as now, doing this retrospective read through sort of in chronological publication order, is that if you remember his previous book, The Survivor, I said this is an author sort of stretching his muscles, trying to expand beyond his start. This is the next quantum leap. Love it or loathe it, he's doing some new and very, very different things with this novel, things he has never attempted before. It's in the first person for a start, and it is a consistent through line narrative. There are no jumping away to little self-contained vignette chapters to give a broader sense of world building or things going on, or sort of disaster building, really, in the case of the rats and the fog. It's an absolutely straight through line, first person, with a real sense of the narrator and the narrator's voice and the narrator's personality, which is something that quite often gets levelled at Herbert, is that all of his heroes are very sort of cut from the same cloth. They're very carbon copied and samey, and to a certain extent that's fair. You absolutely can't say that about Fluke at all. He's a frickin' dog. He is not your standard James Herbert hero, and he's the narrator of the piece. And Herbert's really working at, as I alluded to earlier, hooking you through with the points at which chapters end, and sort of nodding forwards to things that are going to happen next. And he's really honing his craft. I can't help but think that if YA literature had been a thing back then, this would have been made a much bigger splash. He may even have been persuaded to have released it under a pseudonym. In this series of reviews, it is my intention to review any adaptations of the books after I've talked about the book, but I hope you will appreciate, given that this is a horror channel, I will defer on this occasion. I won't review the film Fluke. There's no way I could stretch or bend it to suggest that the review of that film has a place on a horror channel on YouTube. One of the things that Herbert does really successfully in this is he does present the world from a dog's eye view and gives lots of insights into the life of dogs and sort of dog philosophy, if you will. If you're a dog lover like I am, it's absolutely joyous. If you're worried that there's going to be, because it's a James Herbert title, any animal cruelty or any sort of Watership Down moments, there really aren't. It's a sort of modern fairy tale fable. It's a relatively gentle story. It's the adventure of a dog, Fluke, who just happens to have been a man who finds himself reincarnated. I find it strange that for such an outlier in his oeuvre, I think he must have had a soft spot for it, because one of the highlights in the book is where a young Fluke is taken under the wing of a bigger, older, more experienced dog called Rumbo. Another dog like him who's just more self-aware and above the normal intelligence levels of other dogs. Rumbo doesn't really want to talk about it. He just wants to, if you'll forgive the pun, he wants to let sleeping dogs lie about his previous life or the potential thereof. But the character of Rumbo is really a highlight of this novel, and to such an extent that reappears in a couple of his later novels, The Magic Cottage and Once. So Fluke gets woven later into this sort of weird, sort of extended James Herbert universe when Herbert decides to sort of tap into more magical and fantasy stuff. He's found that a good little area of his sort of writing oeuvre to bring Rumbo back in various different reincarnations. And I always found that he was very welcome upon all of his returns. He's not doing anything as grand as Stephen King's Dark Tower design by any stretch of the imagination, but just little things later on in a few other novels for his constant readers, Herbert's version of Stephen King's constant reader, to just see some of the stories get stitched together. For anyone worrying that this is Herbert going off the boil as a horror writer, given that his next novel and the next one we will be looking at is The Spear, I can allay your worries. It ain't gonna happen. Herbert is a dyed-in-the-wool horror writer, and he is straight back gunning it for all it's worth in his next novel. But this curious little diversion, this attempt to try something new, to grow and improve as a writer, I find it charming, endearing. I think it's a great little story. I think sort of your 11, 12, 13-year-olds would really dig it. Unfortunately, if they really dig it and then want to read more of what James Herbert has done, if they're not already horror fans, it might be a bit of a shock to the system. But yes, Fluke, a very, very strange novel for James Herbert to have written, but I personally think an absolutely necessary one for him to have written. He clearly needed to tell that story to get to the next stage in his career as a writer, and I certainly think that some of the things he learnt on Fluke, weirdly you can see him bring it over into The Spear, which is much more on brand for Herbert. But I love Fluke. I'm so glad that he wrote it.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.